Some men carry their confidence like a weapon until someone turns it back on them. A tall young man steps forward at a private gathering in Los Angeles. Arms crossed. He faces the smaller man who just finished a demonstration and says words no one expected. "Stand 30 seconds against me and I'll call you master." The room goes silent. The smaller man nods. The clock starts. The tall man launches a wrist lock that dominated every dojo in Japan. It dissolves instantly. He tries a throw. His momentum sends him stumbling. He spins for one more attempt. The smaller man is already inside his guard. Strikes blur toward chest, ribs, throat, each stopping just short of skin. 7 seconds. Frozen. Defenseless. His name is Steven Seagal. The smaller man is Bruce Lee. What did Lee say next that changed Seagal forever? If the story grips you, stay right here. Now, let me take you back. Not far. Just 6 months before that night. Because this story doesn't begin in that room in Los Angeles. It begins on a plane. A red-eye from Osaka to LAX. And it begins with a lie. Steven Seagal was 21 years old. Tall. 6'4". Wide across the shoulders. He moved through the Osaka airport like he owned the building. And in a way, at least in the world he came from, he kind of did. He had spent the last 3 years training in Aikido under some of the most respected masters in Japan. Not as a tourist. Not as a hobbyist. He lived it. He trained 6 hours a day, sometimes more. He slept on tatami mats. He ate what they ate. He bowed when they bowed. And by the time he boarded that plane, he had earned something very few Westerners had ever earned. A legitimate teaching rank in a traditional Japanese martial art. Now here's the thing. That part was real. Nobody disputes it. Seagal put in the work. He bled on those mats. He earned his place. But somewhere between Osaka and Los Angeles, something shifted. Somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, the discipline he had learned began to mix with something else. Ambition. And not the quiet kind. The kind that makes a man believe he's not just good. He's the best. By the time the plane touched down at LAX, Seagal wasn't thinking like a student anymore. He was thinking like a man who had already arrived. He told himself he had mastered Aikido faster than anyone in the history of the art. He told himself the masters in Osaka had never seen anyone like him. He told himself that what he carried in his hands, his technique, his knowledge was superior to anything being practiced in America. And that included whatever Bruce Lee was doing on movie screens. Believe me, that last part matters. Because in 1973, Bruce Lee wasn't just famous. He was a force. Enter the Dragon had just released. The whole world was talking about him. Martial artists from every discipline were debating his methods, his philosophy, his speed. Some worshipped him. Some resented him. But nobody ignored him. And Seagal, well, Seagal fell into a very specific category. He respected Lee's athleticism. He admitted the man was fast. But he believed, deeply and without hesitation, that Aikido was the superior art. And if the arts ever met head-to-head, technique against technique, the result would prove him right. That belief didn't come from nowhere. In Osaka, Seagal had dominated every sparring partner put in front of him. Bigger men, faster men, men with decades more experience. His wrist locks were devastating. His throws were precise. He could control a man's entire body by gripping 2 fingers. And nobody, not one single person in 3 years, had been able to neutralize his technique. So when Seagal landed in Los Angeles and heard through the martial arts network that Bruce Lee was holding a small, invitation-only demonstration at a private residence in the hills, he didn't just want to attend. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to test himself. And most of all, he wanted to prove something. Not to Lee. Not to the room. To himself. Getting an invitation wasn't easy. The gathering was tight. Maybe 30 people. Serious martial artists. Instructors. A few actors who trained. Seagal didn't know anyone on the list. But he knew people who knew people. He called in a favor from a judo instructor he had trained with briefly in Tokyo. That instructor had a connection to one of Lee's senior students. 2 phone calls later, Seagal had his name on the list. He showed up early, stood near the back of the room. The space was plain. Hardwood floors, a few chairs along the walls, a red wooden door at the entrance that creaked when it opened. Seagal noticed that door. He noticed everything. He was already measuring the room, measuring the distance, measuring the man he had come to challenge. And then Bruce Lee walked in. He was smaller than Seagal expected. 5'7", maybe 140 pounds. He wore a simple black shirt and dark pants. No uniform, no belt, no symbols. He smiled at the room, greeted a few people by name, and moved to the center of the floor like he had done this 1,000 times. Because he had. Lee began his demonstration, and Seagal, for the first time in a long time, felt something he didn't recognize. It wasn't fear. Not yet. It was a crack. A tiny fracture in the wall of certainty he had built around himself. Because the way Bruce Lee moved was unlike anything he had ever seen. Not in Osaka. Not anywhere. Lee didn't demonstrate one style. He demonstrated a principle. He asked a volunteer to attack him. A karate instructor. The man threw a hard straight punch. Lee didn't block it. He intercepted it. His hand met the punch halfway, redirected it, and in the same motion struck the man's chest with an open palm. Light contact, but the karate instructor stumbled back 2 full steps. The room murmured. Then Lee asked for another volunteer, a judo man, thick, maybe 220 pounds. He grabbed Lee's collar and tried a hip throw. Lee dropped his center of gravity so fast it looked like his legs disappeared. He swept the man's ankle and put him flat on his back in under a second. No force, no struggle, just timing. Now get this. Seagal watched both of these exchanges. And instead of recognizing what was happening, instead of processing what he was seeing, he made a decision. He decided Lee was showing off. He decided the volunteers were cooperating. He decided that none of this would work against a real Aikido technique. Against his technique. That decision. Right there. That was the moment everything went wrong. The demonstration ended. Lee opened the floor for questions. A few people asked about Jeet Kune Do philosophy. Someone asked about training schedules. Lee answered each one patiently, clearly, with a smile that never looked forced. The room relaxed. People stood. Conversations started. Someone poured tea near a small table by the wall, and Seagal stepped forward. He didn't wait for an invitation. He didn't raise his hand. He walked to the center of the room and stopped about 6 feet from Bruce Lee. The conversations died. Not all at once, but fast enough. People turned. Lee looked at him. Here's what Seagal said, and I need you to hear every word, because this is where the story turns. I respect your movies, Mr. Lee, but Aikido is the superior art. Stand 30 seconds against me, and I'll call you master for the rest of my life. 30 people held their breath. Nobody moved. One of Lee's senior students, a man named Dan near the red wooden door, took a half step forward. Lee raised one finger. Dan stopped. Lee looked up at Seagal, and he didn't laugh. He didn't mock him. He didn't look offended. He tilted his head slightly, like he was reading something written very small. Then he smiled, not with arrogance, with something closer to recognition, like he had seen this moment coming before Seagal had even walked through the door. 30 seconds, Lee said quietly. Okay. He stepped back, gestured for the room to clear the center. People pressed against the walls. Dan looked at Lee with concern. Lee gave a small nod. Dan pulled out an old pocket watch from his jacket. Silver, scratched. The kind a man carries because it was given to him by someone who mattered. He held it up so the room could see. I'll count, Dan said. The room went still. Seagal set his stance. White, grounded, classic Aikido. Hands open. He looked ready. He looked confident. For a moment, just a moment, you might have believed him. You might have thought this tall young man from Osaka had a chance. Lee stood across from him. Loose, hands at his sides, weight on neither foot. He looked like he was waiting for a bus. Dan raised the pocket watch. The room held its breath. And somewhere in that silence, in that one clean second before everything changed, Seagal felt calm. Completely calm. Like the whole world had gone quiet just for him. Like everything he had trained for had led to this exact moment. Like he was about to prove every word he had ever said about himself. He had no idea what was coming. Dan said, "Go." And everything Seagal believed about himself died in the next 7 seconds. But I'm not going to rush through those seconds. Because each one mattered. Each one broke something different inside Steven Seagal. And if you understand what happened in those 7 seconds, you'll understand everything that came after. Second 1. Seagal moved first. He lunged forward and reached for Lee's right wrist. This was his signature, the kote geishi, a wrist lock reversal that he had used to drop every man he had ever faced. His fingers closed around Lee's wrist. And for one heartbeat he had it. Contact, grip, control. Or so he thought. Lee rotated his forearm. Not fast, not violent, just a small, precise turn. And Seagal's grip dissolved. Not broken, dissolved, like he had tried to grab running water. His fingers were still closing when Lee's wrist was already gone. Second 2. Seagal didn't panic. Give him that. He adjusted. He shifted his weight to his back foot and reached again, this time for Lee's elbow. A standard Aikido redirect. If he could control the elbow, he could control the body. His hand made contact. And this time Lee didn't just slip away. He stepped into Seagal, toward him, closing the distance to almost nothing. And in that instant, the nature of the fight changed completely. Now here's the thing. This is what most people don't understand about what happened in that room. Up until this moment, Seagal thought this was a contest. A test. My art against yours. 30 seconds on the clock. May the best style win. But when Lee stepped into him, when he closed that gap and took away every angle Seagal needed to execute his technique, it stopped being a contest. It became a lesson. And Bruce Lee was the teacher. Second 3. Seagal tried a throw. He grabbed Lee's shirt near the collar and pivoted his hips for an Irimi nage. A classic entering throw. In Osaka, this move had sent 200-pound men flying. Lee didn't resist the throw. He redirected it. He let Seagal's momentum carry him forward and simply wasn't where Seagal expected him to be. Seagal stumbled past Lee. 2 steps. 3. He nearly hit the wall. Someone in the crowd pulled their chair back to give him room. Second 4. Seagal spun around. And this is where he made his worst mistake. He didn't reset. He didn't think. He charged. Full speed. Both hands reaching for any grip he could find. It was desperation. And every person in that room saw it. The composure was gone. The Aikido stance was gone. The calm certainty he had walked in with was gone. He was just a big man lunging at a smaller man and missing. Lee sidestepped. 1 step. That's all it took. Seagal's hands grabbed air. Second 5. Lee went on offense. And this is where the room stopped breathing. Lee threw a straight lead punch toward Seagal's chest. It stopped 1 inch from his sternum. Seagal flinched. His arms came up. But it was already over. The punch had already frozen him. Not the impact. The precision. Seagal had never seen a human being throw a strike that fast and stop it that close. Second 6. Lee threw 2 more strikes. 1 to the ribs. 1 to the throat. Neither made contact. Both stopped at the surface of Seagal's skin. Close enough to feel the wind. Close enough to know that if Lee had wanted to, each one would have landed. Seagal's arms dropped. Not because he gave up. Because his body made the decision before his mind did. His nervous system understood what his ego still refused to accept. There was no defense against this man. Second 7. Lee's right fist moved forward 1 final time. Slow. Almost gentle. It came to rest directly over Seagal's heart. Not touching. Hovering. 1 inch away. Lee held it there. And looked up at him. The room was silent. Dan looked at the pocket watch. 7 seconds. He didn't announce it. He didn't need to. Everyone had counted. Seagal stood frozen. Arms open. Neck exposed. Chest unguarded. Every technique he had spent 3 years mastering had been made useless in less time than it takes to tie a shoe. And the man who had done it wasn't even breathing hard. Bruce Lee lowered his fist. He took one step back. And he looked at Steven Seagal not with contempt. Not with triumph. With something far worse. Understanding. Like he had been exactly where Seagal was standing. A long time ago. And he remembered how it felt. Nobody spoke. The room stayed frozen. 30 people pressed against the walls. Some had their mouths open. A few looked at the floor, embarrassed for the tall man standing in the center of the room with nothing left to hide behind. Seagal's hands were shaking. Not from exhaustion. From shock. His body was still processing what his mind hadn't caught up to. He had thrown his best technique. His absolute best. The move that had never once failed him in 3 years of training. And it had been erased. Not beaten. Not countered. Erased. Like it had never existed. And then Bruce Lee spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lecture. He didn't list everything Seagal had done wrong. He said 7 words. Quiet. Almost soft. The kind of words you say to someone you recognize. Not as an opponent. As a younger version of yourself. You don't owe me a title. You owe yourself more training. That was it. 7 words. And they hit Seagal harder than any fist ever could. Because they weren't cruel. They weren't dismissive. They were true. And Seagal knew it. In that moment, standing in the center of that room with 30 witnesses and nowhere to hide, he knew it. Now here's where most people expect the story to end. The cocky young man gets humbled. He walks away embarrassed. He goes home and sulks. Maybe he tells himself the encounter was unfair. Maybe he rewrites the story in his head so he comes out looking better. That's what most people do when the truth hits them in a place they can't protect. But Seagal didn't do that. He did something that surprised every person in that room, including Bruce Lee. He dropped to one knee. Slowly, deliberately, he placed both hands on the hardwood floor. And he bowed. Deep. Lower than he had ever bowed to any master in Osaka. Lower than he had bowed to the men who gave him his rank. Lower than he had bowed to anyone in his entire life. And he stayed there. 5 seconds. 10. 15. The room was dead quiet. Dan, still holding the pocket watch near the door, looked at Lee. Lee's expression changed. The patient smile was gone. In its place was something raw. Something almost sad. Like he hadn't expected this. Like he had been ready for anger or excuses, or a demand for a rematch. But not this. Not genuine surrender. Lee stepped forward. He placed his hand on the top of Seagal's head. Just for a moment. A gesture that in Japanese martial culture carries enormous weight. It is the gesture of a teacher accepting responsibility for a student. Not ownership. Responsibility. Then Lee pulled his hand back and said, "Stand up." Seagal stood. His eyes were red. He didn't cry. But he was close. And every person in that room could see it. This wasn't performance. This wasn't theater. This was a 21-year-old man realizing that everything he thought he knew about himself was incomplete. Lee turned back to the group. He picked up his tea from the small table near the wall. He took a sip. And just like that, the demonstration was over. People started talking again. Slowly at first. Then normally. As if the last minute hadn't just changed the trajectory of a man's entire life. Now, if this story has kept you here this long, I'm going to ask you one small thing. Just one. If you're listening on a platform that lets you subscribe, hit that button now. Not because I need numbers. Because this story isn't over. And the second half. Believe me, the second half is the part nobody talks about. Seagal didn't leave the room immediately. He walked to the back wall. He stood near the red wooden door. He didn't talk to anyone. Nobody talked to him. But he didn't leave. He stayed for another 40 minutes while small groups formed and broke apart around him. He watched Lee move through the room, shaking hands, answering questions, laughing with students. And something happened during those 40 minutes that Seagal would later describe as the most important moment of his life. More important than the 7 seconds. More important than the bow. More important than Lee's words. Dan walked over to him. Lee's senior student. The one with the pocket watch. He leaned against the wall next to Seagal and didn't say anything for a long time. Then, without looking at him, Dan said, "He did the same thing to me. 4 years ago. Took 9 seconds. Seagal looked at him. Dan still didn't make eye contact. "I was a boxer. Thought my hands were the fastest in any room. He showed me they weren't. I wanted to quit martial arts entirely. Walk away. Never throw another punch." "What stopped you?" Seagal asked. Dan finally turned to look at him. "He did. He called me the next day. Said if I quit, it meant the lesson was wasted. And Bruce Lee does not waste lessons." That was the moment. Right there. Not the 7 seconds. Not the bow. That conversation by the red wooden door. That was the moment Steven Seagal decided he wasn't going to let this destroy him. He was going to let it rebuild him. The gathering ended around 11 that night. People filtered out through the red wooden door one by one. Some shook Lee's hand on the way out. Some bowed. A few lingered to exchange phone numbers or training schedules. Seagal was one of the last to leave. He walked to the door, put his hand on the wood, felt the grain under his palm, and stopped. He turned around. Lee was across the room, folding a towel he had used to wipe his forearms during the demonstration. Seagal stood there for a moment, watching. Then he bowed. One more time. Not deep this time. Just a nod. Respectful. Steady. The bow of a man who has accepted something hard and is choosing to carry it forward instead of leaving it on the floor. Lee saw it. He returned the nod. No words. No wave. Just a look between two men who now understood each other. One who had learned something, and one who had taught it without humiliation. Seagal walked out into the Los Angeles night. The air was cool. The hills were dark. He got into his car. A rented sedan. Nothing fancy. He sat behind the wheel for a long time before starting the engine. He didn't drive back to his apartment right away. He drove to a park. Griffith Park. He parked near the observatory, got out and walked in the dark until he found a bench. And he sat there until morning. Now, I need to tell you what happened next, because this is the part that separates this story from every other story about a man getting humbled. Most men who experience what Seagal experienced that night go one of two directions. They either collapse into bitterness, blame the other person, rewrite the story so it never really happened, or they disappear. They quit. They walk away from the thing that exposed them and never come back. Both paths are easy. Both paths are common. Both paths lead nowhere. Seagal chose a third path. He went back to training. But not the same training. Not the way he had trained in Osaka. He didn't go back to perfecting the techniques he already knew. He started over. From the beginning. He enrolled in a small dojo in West Los Angeles run by a quiet Korean instructor who taught Hapkido and Taekwondo. He didn't tell the instructor about his Aikido rank. He didn't tell him about Osaka. He didn't tell him about Bruce Lee. He walked in wearing a white belt, and he bowed like a beginner. The instructor looked at him. Tall, muscular, obviously experienced. He asked Seagal if he had trained before. Seagal said, "Not enough." That answer, believe me, that answer tells you everything. For the next 18 months, Seagal trained in that small dojo 3 times a week. He also continued his Aikido practice at a separate studio. But the difference was in how he practiced. Before that night in the hills, Seagal trained to dominate. After that night, he trained to understand. He started asking questions he had never asked before. Why does this technique work? When does it fail? What happens when the opponent doesn't do what I expect? What happens when I'm wrong? Those questions changed everything. And here is something that most people don't know. Something that has been confirmed by only a handful of witnesses over the decades. 3 weeks after the gathering, Seagal received a phone call. It was Dan, Lee's student, the one with the pocket watch. "Bruce wants to see you," Dan said. "Tomorrow afternoon. Same house." Seagal showed up. This time there was no crowd, no demonstration, no audience. Just Lee, Dan, and Seagal in that same room with the hardwood floors and the red wooden door. Lee was sitting on the floor, stretching. He gestured for Seagal to sit across from him. They talked for 2 hours. Not about fighting. Not about technique. Not about which art was superior. They talked about ego. About the difference between confidence and arrogance. About what it means to dedicate your life to something and then discover that your understanding of it was only the surface layer of something much deeper. Lee told Seagal a story. He said that when he was 19, he challenged a Tai Chi master in Hong Kong. He won the fight, easily. But the master said something to him afterward that he never forgot. The master said, "You won with your body, but your mind lost, because you needed to win. And a man who needs to win has already lost the most important fight." Lee said it took him years to understand what that meant. He said that by the time he did understand it, he had already built Jeet Kune Do. Not as a style, as a philosophy, the idea that no single art is complete, that every system has walls, and the purpose of training is not to build higher walls. It is to learn how to move through them. Seagal listened. He didn't argue. He didn't defend Aikido. He didn't try to explain what he had meant by his challenge. He just listened. And when Lee finished talking, Seagal asked one question. "Will you teach me?" Lee shook his head. "I don't teach styles, but I'll show you how I think. What you do with it is your problem." Over the next several months, Seagal visited Lee's home 4 more times. Each visit was informal. No uniforms. No bowing. They moved. They talked. They ate. Lee showed Seagal concepts from Wing Chun, from Western boxing, from fencing. Not techniques. Concepts. Timing. Distance. Economy of motion. The idea that the shortest path between 2 points is not always a straight line. The third visit was the one that changed Seagal's approach to Aikido permanently. Lee asked him to demonstrate his best wrist lock. The same kotegaeshi that had failed in 7 seconds. Seagal performed it on Dan. Clean. Fast. Textbook. Dan tapped out immediately. Lee watched. Then he said, "Do it again. But this time, Dan is going to resist in a way you've never seen." Dan grabbed Seagal's wrist before Seagal could grab his. Reversed the grip. Used Seagal's own forward momentum to pull him off balance. Seagal hit the floor. Hard. Lee didn't laugh. He knelt down next to Seagal and said, "Your technique is perfect for the situation you practiced. But a real fight is never the situation you practiced. Your art is honest. But your training has been narrow. Make it wider." Seagal went home that night and wrote those words down on a piece of paper. He taped it to his bathroom mirror. Make it wider. He looked at those words every morning for the next 10 years. The 4th visit was the last. Lee was distracted. Tired. He had been working long hours on a film project. They didn't spar that day. They sat in Lee's backyard and drank tea. Lee talked about his children. About wanting to spend more time with them. About feeling like the movies were pulling him away from the things that mattered most. Seagal mostly listened. At the end of the visit, Lee walked him to the door and said something Seagal would remember for the rest of his life. "Don't become your reputation. Your reputation is what other people need you to be. That's their problem, not yours." 2 weeks later, on July 20th, 1973, Bruce Lee died. He was 32 years old. The world lost one of the most extraordinary martial artists who ever lived. And Steven Seagal lost something he hadn't even fully realized he had gained. A teacher, not a master. Lee would never have accepted that word. A teacher. Seagal heard the news on the radio. He was driving to the Korean dojo for his evening class. He pulled over. He sat in the car. And this time he did cry. Not for long. But he cried. Because the man who had given him the greatest lesson of his life was gone. And there were still so many questions he hadn't asked. He went to training that night anyway. He bowed when he entered the dojo. He practiced for 2 hours. He bowed when he left. And the next day he did it again. And the day after that. And every day for years. Now, let me tell you how this story ends. Or rather, how it doesn't end. Because the truth is, it never really ended for Steven Seagal. He went on to build his career. He opened his own Aikido dojo in Los Angeles. He eventually moved to Hollywood. He made movies. He became famous for the same things he had once believed made him invincible. His wrist locks, his throws, his physical dominance. And yes, over the years, some of that old arrogance came back. Some of the walls rebuilt themselves. That's the honest truth. The lesson didn't make him perfect. No lesson does. But those who knew him, those who were there that night, they say something stayed different. They say that in private, behind the cameras, when the press wasn't around, Seagal carried a quietness that hadn't been there before. A pause before he spoke about other martial artists. A reluctance to call himself the best. A small hesitation, almost invisible, every time someone asked him to compare Aikido to another art. And there was one more thing. Dan confirmed this years later. In Seagal's private office, in every home he ever lived in, he kept one item on his desk. Not a trophy. Not a belt. Not a photograph from a movie set. Pocket watch. Silver. Scratched. The kind a man carries because it was given to him by someone who mattered. Dan's pocket watch. The one that counted 7 seconds. Dan gave it to Seagal the night Bruce Lee died. He showed up at Seagal's apartment, handed it to him and said, "Bruce would want you to keep counting." Seagal never spoke publicly about that night in 1973. He never confirmed it. He never denied it. But the pocket watch sat on his desk. Every day. A quiet reminder of the night a 21-year-old man promised 30 seconds and lasted 7. The night he learned that true strength is not the ability to dominate. It is the ability to be broken open and still keep training. Some men carry their confidence like a weapon. And some men learn, in 7 seconds, that the weapon was never theirs to begin with. It belonged to the truth. And the truth doesn't care how tall you are.